The morning after Victor's sworn statement, Briarwood felt like a city holding its breath. Newspapers ran front-page photographs of Aurora again, its crest half hidden by an angle of sun, as though embarrassed to be caught in the act of existing. Radio hosts spoke with cautious voices about ongoing investigations and allegations. Neighbors at Helena's church whispered in the pews. Even the air in Adrian's loft seemed denser, as if waiting for news to rupture it. Adrian read the paper in silence. He folded it with care and set it beside his coffee. "It's close," he said. "Too close for her to tolerate. Today or tomorrow she'll try something desperate." "What kind of desperate?" I asked. "The kind that smells like smoke," he said. He was right. That afternoon, Elliot returned from a quiet circuit around Margaret's country house with news. Unmarked trucks had come and gone all morning. Boxes carried out, boxes carried in. One he swore was heavy enough to be a safe. "She's moving assets," he said, trying to get ahead of seizure orders. Monroe frowned when we told him. "Let her move them," he advised. "If she hides them, they can be found. If she burns them, the smoke testifies louder than paper ever will." But Margaret did not only move boxes, she moved people. That evening, Samuel called with his voice shaking. "Two men came to the bakery," he said. "They asked if I was the one speaking to lawyers. They didn't threaten. They didn't need to. They looked at my wife's photograph on the wall and then at me and left." Adrian's jaw set. "We'll move her tonight." No argument. We did. Samuel's wife went to her sister's. Samuel stayed behind, stubborn, refusing to abandon his ovens, but Elliot installed cameras above the door, and Adrian set up a system of calls that would summon half the precinct if Samuel did not answer within 2 rings. Fear was becoming muscle memory. We were teaching ourselves to live with it and not to let it paralyze. Helena, steady as stone, baked with Samuel the next morning as if to anchor him. She kneaded dough with her sleeves rolled high and her hair pinned back. "If she wants to frighten us," she said, folding flour into strength, "she should remember we were frightened long ago. Watching my mother in that bakery, I understood that courage is not fire. It is bread, simple, sustaining, multiplied by sharing." 2 days later came the raid. Aurora's doors opened at dawn to officers with warrants. They carried boxes out through the marble lobby in a procession that made patients stare and staff whisper. Margaret arrived mid-morning, immaculate in navy silk, her pearls defiant, her smile unbroken. Cameras flashed. She walked past the officers as if they were bellboys carrying luggage she had tipped too well. She did not falter until she saw me sitting in the lobby, reading a novel I could not later recall. Our eyes locked. Something old and brittle cracked in the space between us. The raid uncovered more than even Monroe had dared hope. Falsified invoices, receipts with initials that matched the ledger, correspondence with shell companies, and, most damning, a thumb drive taped beneath the drawer of her desk. On it, spreadsheets, schedules, scanned contracts. Digital fingerprints she had forgotten or believed too clever to be found. Monroe examined it with the reverence of a priest lifting a relic. "This," he said, "is the roof beam." That evening we gathered at Adrian's loft. Monroe, Ellis, Elliot, Samuel, Marjorie, Helena, and me. Papers and photographs covered the table until it looked like the aftermath of a storm that had torn through an office. Monroe spoke gravely. "It will go to trial. It will not be swift. She will fight every inch. But this is enough to keep her in court until she surrenders or the law finishes the work." Samuel's hands shook as he poured tea from his kettle. "And in the meantime," he asked. "In the meantime," Adrian said, "we hold steady. We show her that ordinary people do not break." Margaret was not done. The night before her first appearance, Elliot caught sight of a figure in the shadows near Helena's fence. He gave chase, but the man slipped away. On the wood, in chalk, someone had scrawled, "Blood doesn't lie." Helena washed it away before I arrived, but the ghost of the words lingered. She looked at me steadily. "She wants you broken," she said. "Don't give her that." Arraignment and discovery. The courthouse smelled like old paper and lemon oil. At the arraignment, Margaret stood between 2 attorneys as if they were ceremonial pillars. She pleaded not guilty in a voice that could have hosted a luncheon. The judge, gray-browed, deliberate, set a schedule whose neat lines could not predict how messy the days between would become. Discovery was war disguised as paperwork. Ellis submitted requests. Margaret's counsel responded with oceans of objections. Monroe filed motions. Opposing counsel filed counters, each one a small brick stacked on the path to delay. We built timelines on butcher paper taped to Adrian's walls, dates of emails, cash withdrawals, inspections that arrived like weather on the very days a debtor had asked for mercy. We cross-referenced ledger entries with bank records, receipts, calendar reminders. I learned to love the stubborn clarity of a spreadsheet. It does not lie. It merely waits for you to ask a better question. At night we rehearsed. If I were called, Ellis said, he wanted me to sound like a woman who had been humiliated and then educated. "You are not a saint," he reminded me. "You are a citizen." Samuel practiced delivering sentences that shook less. Marjorie practiced saying no. She didn't order me to do it when asked about tasks that were always implied. Ward rehearsed names that tasted like guilt. Margaret countered with theater. She gave an interview to a glossy magazine about charity and legacy, posing in a suit the color of rain. She smiled at cameras on the courthouse steps with the poise of a woman certain she would win because she always had. She sent Victor to stand beside her, gaunt, haunted, but dutiful. The picture looked almost like a wedding if you did not know what vows had been broken. # 2. Motions and maneuvers. The first major hearing concerned the admissibility of the ledger photographs. Margaret's counsel argued chain of custody, privacy, unreasonable search. Ellis answered with a calm recitation that felt like slowly closing a door. The ledger found in a room she had no right to treat as an office, in a facility that had granted officers access. The photographs taken as notes by a witness to a crime. The thumb drive whose metadata sang dates we could place on a calendar and match to transactions like a chorus to a melody. The judge admitted the photos. Margaret did not look at me, but the corner of her mouth tightened the way a seam tears when a dress is one size too small. Next came a motion to exclude Samuel's testimony as prejudicial. Ellis replied that justice without prejudice would be theater without audience. The judge allowed Samuel to speak, reminding counsel that cross-examination is a scalpel, not a club. Samuel sat outside the courtroom after and stared at his hands as though they belonged to a stronger man. Helena brought him tea in a paper cup and said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only language people understand as respect. # 3. Trial. Summer laid its warm hand on Briarwood as the trial opened. Reporters camped on the steps. The jury filed in. Teachers, a nurse, a mechanic, a librarian. People who wore the city the way you wear a coat you did not choose but learned to love. The judge explained the ritual, the burden, the rules. The clerk read charges that sounded like stones: fraud, conspiracy, bribery, coercion. Ellis's opening was plain. He did not promise fireworks. He promised paper, contracts, emails, ledgers, invoices. He promised voices, a baker, a cleaner, an inspector, a brother. He promised a pattern that, once seen, could not be unseen. Margaret's counsel opened with a hymn: philanthropy, community, misunderstanding. They said I was bitter, that Adrian wanted revenge, that Samuel was confused, that Marjorie was disgruntled, that Ward was weak. They held up the glossy magazine. The jury looked unimpressed by gloss. Samuel testified first. His hands trembled, but his voice held. He told how the inspections arrived precisely when business was best, how a supplier who claimed loyalty defaulted overnight, how a breaker mysteriously failed a week after an electrician had been helping with upgrades. He described the day Margaret offered a loan, cash in an envelope, interest that ballooned when he balked, terms rewritten in pencil at her kitchen table. He spoke of shame, and the jury leaned forward as if remembering their own. On cross, Margaret's attorney tried to make Samuel choose between being a fool or a liar. Samuel refused both. I was desperate, he said. Desperation is neither. When counsel asked why he had not gone to the police, Samuel said, because I didn't know which ones ate from her hand. Murmurs moved through the gallery like wind through wheat. The judge's gavel tapped once. Enough, Marjorie testified next. She described Aurora in detail that only a cleaner notices. The corridor where tile always dries streaky, the office plants that shed exactly on Thursdays, the way Margaret's heels sounded different from any other pair of shoes. She told of the office that was not an office, of the black ledger, of the locked cabinet. She did not embellish. When counsel suggested she resented Margaret, Marjorie smiled a thin, tired smile. Resentment is expensive, she said. I've never had the budget for it. I have the budget for mops. Laughter rippled. The judge allowed himself a ghost of a smile. Ward, the inspector, sat like a man confessing at church. He named dates. He named sums. He named the smell of toner and fear in the envelopes. On cross, he did not try to excuse himself. I did it, he said. I was wrong. I am here because being wrong doesn't stop being wrong when you close your eyes. The jury watched him the way people watch a man learning to walk again. I took the stand. Ellis asked me to describe the morning in the towel. I did, without ornament. My voice did not break. He asked about the letter. The signature traced in pencil, the crest of Aurora embossed on paper. He asked about the night in the storage room, the black ledger, the margin note, Deputy Mayor 10%. He asked about the safe, the kettle, the album. He did not ask me to hate. He asked me to remember. On cross, counsel suggested I had invaded privacy, that I had stolen, that I had set out to ruin a woman out of spite. Spite is noisy, I said. I did this in silence. The documents did their work without applause. Spreadsheets with dates that rhymed with deposits. emails that contradicted interviews, contracts that danced in time with campaign contributions. The thumb drive's metadata sang in a monotone choir that made the jury's eyes sharpen. A forensic accountant explained it all in sentences that landed like neat bricks. Margaret did not testify. Her attorneys rested on the argument that none of it touched her directly, only a fog of associates and assumptions. But fog, we showed, is simply a cloud at ground level. If you stand in it long enough, you get wet, #IV. The waiting. When the judge sent the jury to deliberate, Briarwood held its breath again. We waited in a corridor that smelled like coffee and nerves. Reporters rehearsed stand-ups in murmurs. Lawyers pretended to read. I watched a young bailiff polish a scuff off his shoe with his thumb. Helena worked a crossword with militant focus. Adrian stared at a point in the middle distance as if willing time to behave itself. Hours. A note from the jury, clarification on an instruction. Another hour. I walked the block twice, then 3 times, counting paces to keep my mind from writing speeches it had no right to write. When the bailiff finally said we have a verdict, my knees remembered their job. The courtroom felt colder than when we'd left it. The jury filed in with faces set to neutral. The foreperson stood. The clerk asked the question. The answer came stone by stone: guilty on fraud, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on bribery, not guilty on one count of coercion, guilty on another. Not everything. Enough to bind her to the consequences of a life lived as if other lives were furniture. Margaret did not flinch. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, a queen deposed only by ceremony. Victor closed his eyes. I looked at Margaret and felt not triumph but release, as if a weight I had carried on my spine had finally slipped free. She turned her eyes to me once more. There was no fury now, no triumph, only a fatigue so deep it looked like a wound. #V sentencing. Sentencing came weeks later, because the law likes to count slowly when it decides how long a person will count days. In that time, the city discussed reform as if it had invented the idea. The deputy mayor's office grew a new staff. Aurora appointed an interim director who actually used the word audit without wincing. People I had not seen in years sent notes that said proud of you without asking whether they had earned the right to say so. In the courtroom, the judge invited victim statements. Samuel stood and spoke about mornings when he had measured flour with hands too shaky to hold a scoop, about shame that had clung like smoke, about the way tea tasted again when his kettle came home. Marjorie spoke about small humiliations that add up the way pennies do, worthless alone, heavy in a jar. Ward spoke about sleeping without waking to count his sins. Helena did not speak. She sent a letter in her tidy hand about gardens, and about the difference between pruning and ripping things out by the roots. I did not read a statement. I looked at Margaret and said only, "You taught me that silence keeps tyrants alive. I will not be quiet again." The judge measured years with the gravity of a man who knows years are not numbers. He spoke of harm and pattern and public trust. He ordered restitution that would thread through Margaret's remaining wealth like a new backbone. He assigned a term that sounded both too long and not long enough, because no sentence ever rewrites a past, only a future. Margaret's face did not move as the words fell. When the deputies approached, she turned to Victor. "Stand up straight," she told him, in the same tone she had used when he was 8 and tracking mud into the foyer. He did. She walked out as if to a luncheon, her spine unbroken, her shoes quiet on the tile. It was almost admirable, that last performance, almost #V aftermath. The papers filled with editorials about corruption and courage. The radio spoke of reform. Samuel's bakery filled with customers who had once passed by without looking. Marjorie's daughter visited her at Aurora, and told her she was proud. Helena's roses bloomed again, thicker, more fragrant, as if determined to reclaim what had been stolen. Adrian and I sat on his balcony with cups of coffee and the sound of the city below us. For the first time in months, we allowed silence to mean peace instead of strategy. Victor came to me one last time. He asked forgiveness. I told him forgiveness was a road, not a door, and he would have to walk it himself. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and left. I do not know where he went, perhaps to start over, perhaps only to keep breathing. I wished him well in my heart, though my mouth remained closed. As for Margaret, she began holding court in the small universe of her confinement. Reporters said she collected stories the way some people collect stamps, tales of what might have been. Perhaps she will always live there in that museum of the almost. The law is a wall. Regret is a mirror hung on it. #7. Appeals and reform. Appeals are paperwork with ambitions. Her lawyers filed them, ineffective counsel, prejudicial publicity, the usual chorus sung in a new key. Ellis answered with a patience that made impatience look foolish. The appellate court affirmed the verdict with words so dry they might have been dust. Still, dust is what you find after a fire, and it tells you where the flames have been. Aurora submitted to an audit that made administrators gulp and say of course too often. The board asked Marjorie to join a committee on workplace dignity. She refused at first, I have mops, then accepted when Helena said committees need hands that have known bleach. Policies changed. Doors that had been closed at odd hours now stayed propped open with wedges. The storage room became a storage room again. The second office ceased to exist except as a cautionary tale told to new volunteers. If you ever begin to think you deserve a secret, go home. The city council passed an ethics ordinance with teeth. Board spoke at the hearing and did not sweat. A reporter asked me for a quote. I said, ordinary people get extraordinary when you make them carry injustice long enough. She printed the sentence without correcting my grammar. I left it as it was, I meant the plainness. #8 Rebuilding. Adrian bought a building near the river and turned the ground floor into a workshop for small businesses whose ledgers were heavier on hope than on cash. Samuel taught a weekly class there about margins and yeast. He hung his kettle on a hook by the door like a bell. When it chimed, people smiled even if they did not know why. Marjorie trained young cleaners in how to keep a place honest. You clean the corners first, she told them, because that's where people hide their dirt. Ward came by sometimes to talk about inspections and how to do them without becoming the kind of man who needs to confess later. Helena's garden became a map of healing. Roses climbed the fence like handwriting corrected at last. She planted herbs because they forgive neglect and reward attention. We ate soup at her table on Sundays, and sometimes Adrian brought butter cookies from the same bakery he had always favored. The difference now was that we knew the baker's name and he knew ours. I moved out of the loft and into a small apartment with morning light. The first night I opened all the cabinets and shut them again, just to hear the ordinary sound of doors that belonged to me. I hung one photograph on the wall. Helena at 20, eyes bright, holding the hand of the man who would become my father. The picture was not in Margaret's album. It was in a shoebox Helena had kept under her bed, safe from both worship and vandalism. I did not frame the album we recovered. I put it away. Some reliquaries deserve dark. Victor sent a postcard from a town with mountains in the distance and a lake that looked polished by the sky. I'm learning to cook eggs, he wrote. It turns out they require attention. I stared at the sentence a long time. Attention is what he had handed to Margaret for a lifetime. Perhaps he was finally learning how to give some to himself. #ix. A visit. Months later I visited Margaret. I did not go to taunt or to gloat. I went because stories like ours have threads that tangle if you leave them hanging. She sat on a metal chair, immaculate even in regulation clothes. The room smelled like disinfectant and fatigue. She looked at me without surprise. You have his eyes, she said again, as if handing me a diagnosis. You said that before, I answered. I kept them, she gave a small, humorless laugh. Did you come to ask me why? I know why, I said. You loved a man who chose someone else. You turned that choice into a religion. You made offerings to it in envelopes and ledgers and debts. That's a prettier story than I deserve, she said. The uglier one is simpler. I liked power, I nodded. I know that too. For a moment we sat in a silence that did not belong to enemies. Then she leaned forward. Do you hate me? I thought I did, I said. But hate is a small room. I outgrew it, she leaned back. I did not, she said, and there was no triumph in it. Only fact. When I left, the air outside smelled like hot pavement after sudden rain. I stood on the steps and let the steam touch my face until my breath matched the city's again. #X, closing the chapter. On the anniversary of the day the ledger came out of the drawer, we gathered at the workshop Adrian had built. People brought food because that is how cities heal themselves when policy is slow. Samuel baked 3 pies and cut the first slice for the woman who had once written a mercy note on his bill when he could not pay. This time he handed her a receipt that said paid in full and meant more than money. Marjorie arrived late with a bouquet of cheap supermarket roses that smelled like memory anyway. Helena wore a blue dress that made her look like herself, which was the whole point. Elliot stood in a corner smiling his half-smile, like a man who had moved furniture while the rest of us argued about paint. Monroe and Ellis came together in suits that looked less like armor than like habit now. The deputy mayor's replacement sent a note, "We're still cleaning." It did not read like an excuse, it read like a job description. I raised a glass. I am not a speechmaker, but some words insisted. We learned something, I said. That rot grows in silence, that it's not enough to be decent in private, that bread and roses matter, and so do receipts, that a ledger can be a weapon and so can a kettle, and so can a woman who refuses to be quiet. People laughed, softly, at the kettle line. Samuel rang it once for punctuation. The sound was clear and ordinary. Later, in the calm after everyone left, I stood alone in the workshop and looked at the tables, the tools, the clean corners. I thought of the bathroom door opening on a morning that had turned into exile. I thought of the alley behind the Whitmore apartment where the lilacs had bruised my arms as I lowered a stolen kettle to safety. I thought of photographs torn and photographs kept, of names rewritten and names restored, of the smell of paper that has finally found its proper box. I went home and opened the windows. Briarwood breathed in and out. The river kept its quiet promise. I made tea, not as ritual but as relief, and sat at the small table by the window while steam rose. The cup warmed my hands. I did not cry. I did not even smile. I simply felt the weight of the story settle into its place, not gone, not forgiven, but arranged. ### 11. Epilogue. Ordinary light. Time did not make us saints. It made us specific. Adrian still wakes early and reads the paper with care, folding it like a man making a map. Helena still coaxes roses and soups out of seasons that would rather not give them. Samuel still checks his locks twice, then laughs at himself and leaves them as they are. Marjorie still keeps a rag in her pocket even when she's in her church clothes, because you never know when dignity will require polish. Lord sends Christmas cards that say nothing about redemption and everything about weather and grandchildren. As for me, I work at the workshop 3 days a week, teach a small class on records and receipts, how to keep them, how to read them, how to know when they are telling you a story you don't want to hear. I walk by the river most evenings. When I pass Aurora, I do not hurry. The rising sun crest looks smaller now. Maybe it always was. Maybe I was the one who changed size sometimes. In the mirror, I see my father's eyes and my mother's hands and a woman I recognize because I built her on purpose. Sometimes I remember Margaret's question, "Do you hate me?" and answer it again for myself. Number, I hate the systems that rewarded her. I hate the silence that fed her. I hate the part of me that thought once that endurance was the same as consent. But her, no hate would keep me in a room with her forever. I have better rooms now. The story is not over. Stories never are. Appeals linger. Reforms stall. People backslide. New tyrants audition for old roles. But I know what to do when the door opens on a morning that tries to tell me who I am. Wrap myself in nothing but truth, step into the yard and refuse to be sent back inside. For the first time since the shower that began it all, I feel clean. Not because water washed me, water lies, but because light did, and witnesses and work. And the stubborn ordinary that tyrants always underestimate, a ledger, a kettle, a garden, a city that remembers how to breathe.